So, ready to learn some mind bending facts about yourself and others? So, let's get started. First up, we have the spotlight effect. This is when we think everyone's watching us, but they are not. Remember that time you tripped in the public and felt like the whole world saw? Chances are most people didn't even notice. Next up, we have halo effect. It's when we assume someone good at one thing is good at everything. Like think a handsome actor must also be a smart and the kind, but look can be deceiving. Well, have you heard of a confirmation bias? We tend to look for information that supports what we already believe. We often ignore facts that challenge our views. This can make it hard to change our mind even when we are wrong. Now, let's discuss the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's when people with a little knowledge think they are expert. Meanwhile, true experts often doubt their abilities. Isn't it funny how confident and the competence don't always match? Here is an interesting one, a social proof. We tend to follow what others are doing, especially in the uncertain situation. Ever pick a busy restaurant over an empty one? That's a social proof in action. Well, let's talk about the cognitive dissonance. It's the discomfort we feel when our actions don't match our beliefs. We often change our belief to match our actions, not the other way around. Well, have you ever justified a bad decision to make yourself feel better? Next up is the availability heuristic. We judge how likely something is based on how easily we can think of example. That's why we might fear shark attacks more than a car accidents, even though car accidents are much more common. Well, have you experienced the sunk cost fallacy? It's when we continue with something because we have already invested time and the money, like finishing a bad movie just because we have watched half of it. Sometimes it's better to cut our losses and move on. Now, let's explore anchoring bias. This is when we rely too heavily on the first information we receive. For example, the first price we see often influences how much we are willing to pay. That's why sales tactics often show a high original price cross out. Here is a fun one, the IKEA effect. We tend to value things more if we have put efforts into creating them. That's why your wobbly homemade shelf might be your favorite piece of furniture. It's not just a shelf, it's your creation. Now, let's talk about a projection bias. This is when we assume others think and feel the same way. It can lead to misunderstanding and the conflicts. Remember, everyone has a unique perspective. Have you heard of the just world hypothesis? It's the belief that people get what they deserve in life. This can lead to victim blaming and the lack of empathy. The world isn't always fair. Bad things happen to good people as well. Now, let's discuss choice overload. Having too many options can make decisions making harder. Ever stood in front of the wall of cereal boxes, unable to choose? Sometimes less really is more. Here is an interesting one, group polarization. When like-minded people discuss their views, they often become more extreme. Well, this can happen in an online forum or in a echo chambers. Well, it's important to explore ourselves to different viewpoints. Let's explore the fundamental attribution error. We tend to blame others or others' action on their personality, but our own on circumstances. For example, if someone is late, they are irresponsible. But if we are late, it's because of the terrible traffic. Well, have you experienced the peak end rule? We judge experiences mainly by most intent point and how they end. That's why a vacation with a great last day might seem better overall, even if there were some bumps along the way. Now, let's talk about reciprocity. Well, we feel obligated to return favors, even small ones. That's why free samples can be such an effective marketing tool. We feel like we owe the store something in a return. Here is a common one: cognitive load. Our brain have limited processing power. When we are overwhelmed with the information, our decision making suffers. That's why it's hard to concentrate when we are stressed or tired. Let's discuss the Burnham effect. It's where we believe walk general personality descriptions apply specifically to us. This is why horoscopes and the personality test can seem too accurate or so accurate. Well, there is often written to apply to almost everyone. Well, have you heard of reactance? We tend to do the opposite of what we have told to assert our freedom. Tell everyone not to do something, and they might want to do it even more. This is why reverse psychology can sometimes be effective. Now, let's explore social loafing. We tend to put in a less effort when working in a group. Ever been in a group or group project where not everyone pulled their weight? That's a social loafing in action. Here is an interesting one: the pratfall effect. We tend to like people more after they have made a mistake. It makes them seem more human and relatable. So don't worry too much about being perfect all the time. Now let's talk about the loss aversion. We feel the pain of losing something more intensely than the pleasure of gaining it. That's why it's so hard to get rid of things we don't need. And that's why limited time offers can be so tempting. Well, have you ever experienced the curse of knowledge? Once we know something, it's very hard to imagine not knowing it. This can make it difficult to explain things to beginners. Experts often struggle to teach their projects for there or this reason. Now, let's discuss stereotypes. Our brain like to categorize things to process information quickly, but this can lead to unfair judgment about individuals. Well, it's important to recognize and challenge our stereotypes. Here is a common one: selective attention. We can't pay attention to everyone or everything, so our brains filter information. Ever bought a new car and suddenly noticed that model is everywhere? It was always there, but now your brain consider it important. Now let's explore the in-group bias. We tend to favor members of our group over others. This can be a bias on anything from nationality to favorite sport team. Is a major source of the conflict in the world. Have you heard of the Dharma number? It suggests we can only maintain about 150 stable social relationships. Beyond that, we struggle to keep track of people and how we relate to them. That's why social media friends often don't feel like a real friendship. Now, let's talk about hindsight bias. After an event occurs, we tend to see it as more predictable than it was. We say things like, I knew it all along, or it was obvious. However, predicting the future is much harder than explaining the past. Here is an interesting one: the illusion of transparency. We overestimate how well others can read our emotional state. When we are nervous, we think it's obvious to everyone. In reality, people are not as perspective as we think. Now let's discuss the functional fixedness. This is when we can only see objects as serving their common functions. This limits our problem solving abilities. For example, seeing a shoe only as a footwear, not as a potential hammer. Well, have you ever experienced the Zeigarnik effect or Zeigarnik effect? Unfinished tasks tend to stick in our mind more than completed one. Now, let's explore the bandwagon effect. We tend to adapt beliefs or behaviors because many other people do. This can lead to trends, fads, or even mass panics. Well, it's important to think critically rather than just following the crowd. Here is a common one: the herd mentality. In uncertain situations, we often follow what others are doing. This can lead to both positive and the negative outcomes. It's why we might join in applause even if we didn't hear the performance. Let's talk about the gambler's fallacy. It's the belief that past events influence future outcomes in a random processes. Like thinking a coin is a due for heads after a string of tails. Each flips is actually independence and has the same 50-50 chances. Well, have you ever heard of the self-serving bias? We tend to take credit for our successes but blame for external factors for our failures. Well, I got A on a test because I am smart, but fail in the test because the teacher must be unfair. Now let's discuss the bystander effect. The more people present in an emergency, the less likely any individual is to help. Everyone assumes someone else will take action. That's why it's important to directly ask individuals for help in the emergencies. Here is an interesting one: the Pygmalion effect. Our expectation of others can influence their performance. If a teacher believes in a student is a bright, the student often performs better. Our beliefs can become self-fulfilling prophecies. Let's explore the decoy effect. Adding a third, less attractive option can influence our choice between two options. For example, a medium popcorn might seem like a better deal when there is an overpriced charge. Marketers often use this guide for their purchasing decisions. Well, have you experienced the spotlight effect? We tend to overestimate how much attention others pay to our appearances and the action. Remember that embarrassing moment you can't forget, chances are no one else even remember it. Now let's talk about the mere exposure effect. We tend to like things simply because we are familiar with them. That's why companies show you the same ad over and over again. They are not just reminding you, they are making you like their products more. Here is a common one: the planning fallacy. We consistently underestimate how long tasks will take to complete. That's why projects often run over time and the budget. Well, it's important to build in extra time for unexpected delays. Now let's discuss the Bader-Meinhof phenomena. After learning about something new, you suddenly notice it is everywhere. It's not that it's occurring more frequently, you are just more aware of it now. Well, have you ever heard the framing effect? The way information is presented can affect our decisions. For example, 90% fat free sounds better than 10% fat. Well, it is the same information, just framed differently. Now, let's explore the placebo effect. Our belief in a treatment can produce a real physical effect. This shows the powerful connection between mind and the body. That is why some people feel better after taking sugar pill. They think they are medicine. Well, here is an interesting one: the hound throne effect. People tend to change their behavior when they know they are being observed. Well, this can make it difficult to study natural behavior, and it's why a reality show isn't always very real. Well, let's talk about the endowment effect. We tend to value things more highly simply because we own them. That's why it's too hard or so hard to let go of the possessions, even one we don't use. Well, it's also why free trials can be effective marketing tool. Well, have you experienced the anchor observer bias? We tend to attribute our own actions to external causes, but others' actions to internal causes. If we are late, it's because of the traffic. If someone is late, it's because of their irresponsible. Now, let's discuss the false consensus effect. We tend to overestimate how much others agree with our beliefs and the behaviors. This can lead to surprise when we discover differing options or opinions. Well, it's important to remember that our perspective isn't universal. Here is a common one: the negative bias. We tend to remember and focus on the negative experiences more than the positive ones. That's why one criticism can overweight several compliments. It's important to consciously appreciate positive moments as well. Now let's explore the Dunning-Kruger effect. People with limited knowledge tend to overestimate their abilities. Meanwhile, experts often underestimate their abilities, and it's why some people can be confidently incorrect. Well, have you heard of the unavailability heuristics or availability heuristics? We judge the probability of even based on how easily we can recall experiences. That's why we might fear plane crashes more than a car accident, even though car accidents are more or much common. Now, let's talk about the self-fulfilling prophecy. Our expectation about a situation can influence the outcomes. If you believe you are fail in the test, you might not study as hard, leading to the failure. Our beliefs can shape our reality. Here is an interesting one: the cheerleader effect. People tend to look more attractive in a groups than individuals. Our brains averagely out average out the feature of the group, creating a more attractive whole. And it's why group photos often look better than the individual ones. Let's discuss the backfire effect. When presented with the evidence against our beliefs, we might become more convinced we are right. It's why debates really change people's mind. We tend to doubt down or double down on our existing beliefs where challenged. Have you experienced the halo effect? We tend to think people who are good at one thing are good at everything. For example, assuming a physical attractive person is also kind and the intelligence. Well, it's important to judge each trait independently. Now, let's explore the nocebo effect. The opposite of the placebo effect is a negative expectations can lead to negative outcomes. If we believe a medicine will have a side effect, we are more likely to experience them. Our mind can sometimes work against us. Here is a common one: a Parkinson law. Work expands to fill the time available for its completions. That's why we often finish tasks just before the deadline. Setting shorter deadlines can sometimes increase our productivity. Now let's talk about the primacy effect. We tend to remember the first time in a series better than those in the middle. That's why first impressions are so important. It's also why the opening of the speech or presentation is crucial. Well, have you ever heard of the recency effect? We also tend to remember last atom in the series better than those in the middle. That's why the ending of the movie or book is so important. It's what we are left with when the experiences is over. Now, let's discuss the imposter syndrome. High achievers often feel like a fraud despite evidence of their competence. They might attribute their success to luck rather than skills. It's important to recognize and challenge these feelings. Here is an interesting one: the misinformation effect. Our memories can be altered by the information we receive after an event. And this is why eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. Our brain often fill in the gaps with what we think should have happened. Now let's explore the cocktail party effect. We can focus on the single conversation in a noisy room. Our brain filter out irrelevant background noise, but we will still hear our name if it's mentioned elsewhere in the room. Well, have you experienced the spacing effect? We learn better when we speed out our studying over time. Cramming the night before test is less effective than regular space out study sessions. Our brain need time to process and consolidate information. Now let's talk about the mere ownership effect. We tend to value things more highly simply because we own them. That's why it's hard to sell things for what they are worth. We often think our possessions are more valuable than they are. Here is a common one: the fundamental attribution error. We tend to attribute others or others' behavior to their personality, ignoring situations factors. If someone cut off in traffic, we might think they are jerk. We really consider that they might be rushing to an emergency. Now let's discuss the illusion of control. We often overestimate our ability to control events. This is why some people think they can influence the outcome of the coin test. But it's important to recognize what we can and can't control. Well, have you ever heard of the sunk cost fallacy? We continue investigating or investing in something because of past investment, ignoring future costs. Like finishing a bad book because we have already read it half. Sometimes it's better to cut our losses and move on. Here is an interesting one, the confirmation bias. We tend to search for information that confirm our existing beliefs. We also tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting our positions. It's important to actively seek out opposing viewpoints as well. Let's talk about the clustering illusion. We tend to see patterns in random events where none actually exist. This is why we might think a coin is due for heads after a string of fall. Well, it's important to remember that random events can cluster by chances. Well, have you ever experienced the anchoring effect? We rely too heavily on the first piece of information offered when making decisions. This is why the starting price in a negotiation is so important. Well, it set the standards for the rest of your decisions. Now, let's discuss the illusory truth effect. We tend to believe false information to be correct after repetitive exposure. Here's a common one, the overconfidence effect. We tend to overestimate our ability and the accuracy of our beliefs. This can lead to poor decision making and the unnecessary risk. Well, it's important to honestly assess our limitations. Now let's explore the Dunbar numbers. This suggests we can only maintain about 150 stable social relationships. Beyond this, we struggle to keep track of people and how we relate to them. This might explain why social media friends often don't feel like real friendship. Here is an interesting one, the peak end rule. We judge experiences largely based on how they were at their peak and how they ended. This is why a vacation with a great last day might seem better overall, even if there were some bumps along the way. Let's discuss the reactance theory. When our freedom are threatened, we tend to react by wanting them more. This is why telling someone not to do something might make them want to do more. Well, have you ever experienced the curse of knowledge? Once we know something, it's hard to imagine not knowing it. This can make it difficult for experts to explain things to beginners. It's important to remember what it was like to be a novice. Now, let's explore the pratfall effect. We tend to find people more likable after they have made a mistake. It makes them seem more human and relatable. This is why vulnerability can sometimes increase our charisma. So friends, we have covered a lot of ground today. These 100 quirks of human psychology shows just how complex our mind are. Next time you make a decisions on interest with others, think about these biases. You might catch yourself falling into some of these mental traps. Remember, awareness is the first step to overcoming these biases. Well, thank you for joining me on this journey through the human mind. Well, if you found this interesting, give the video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating insight into human behavior. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and stay curious.